In a quiet, rural town where the roads are long and the air smells of fresh earth, an unlikely encounter unfolds, one that will linger in the hearts of both its participants. An old man, weathered by time and experience, rides a dilapidated motorcycle down a lonely stretch of road. His body is frail, his face marked with the stories of years long past, but there is something indomitable in the way he carries himself, as if the years have only deepened his resolve. His hands grip the handlebars with quiet purpose, his movements deliberate, yet there's an air of serenity about him, as though he's seen the world in all its forms and learned to accept it. The sun hangs low in the sky, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement as the sound of the engine hums a steady tune against the backdrop of the open country. But this peaceful moment is shattered when a police car, its siren flickering with urgency, pulls up behind him, casting bright blue lights across the empty road. The officer inside, young and brash, doesn't even wait for the man to pull over before stepping out, his boots crunching against the gravel. His uniform is neat, his expression taut with suspicion, his eyes narrowing as he sizes up the old man on the motorcycle. To the officer, the man is an anomaly, a figure out of place in the pristine order of his small town, an unwelcome interruption to the monotony of his daily patrol. With a sharp motion, the officer waves the man to stop, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. "Where do you think you're going, old man?" he demands, his tone rough and impatient, laced with an underlying assumption that the man before him is trouble waiting to happen. The officer stands tall, exuding authority, but his stance betrays an uncertainty, a crack in the shell of his bravado. He has seen people like the old man before, unsettling, unkempt, and hard to read, and in his mind, that marks them as threats. Yet the old man does not respond in kind. He does not raise his voice, does not tense, does not flinch under the officer's scrutiny. Instead, his gaze is steady, calm, and as the officer looks into his eyes, he feels a weight, something deep and quiet, that he can't quite place. The man's face, lined with the passage of time, is etched with the kinds of memories the officer can't even begin to fathom. With a single, deliberate movement, the old man lowers his goggles, wipes the dust from his face, and meets the officer's gaze without a flicker of fear or hostility. His voice, when it finally comes, is quiet but firm, carrying a depth that seems to reach back through time. "Just passing through," he says, his words simple, but his tone betrays a wisdom that the officer doesn't understand. The officer's frustration only grows as the man's calm demeanor refuses to be rattled. His fingers twitch at the radio on his belt, but he holds off, unwilling to escalate things without cause. Instead, he presses harder, demanding more details, wanting a reason to justify his suspicion, to rationalize his impulse to question the old man's presence. "You don't look like you belong here," the officer snaps, his words sharper now, laced with an unspoken judgment. But the old man merely nods, as if acknowledging the officer's doubt, yet offering nothing more. There's a brief silence between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts, the officer's internal suspicion, and the old man's resignation to the way people like him are always seen as outsiders, never fully understood. It's a quiet war of perception, where the officer's assumptions about who the man is clash against the reality of a life lived with a different set of rules. The officer's heart pounds in his chest, his own mind racing to justify his growing impatience. He wants to believe there's something off about the old man, something worth investigating. But the more the officer stares into the old man's eyes, the more he wonders if his assumptions are simply born of fear of someone who doesn't fit the neat, familiar mold of the town's population. The old man, however, remains unmoved, his gaze steady and calm, as if this moment was nothing new. In the span of a few minutes, the two men, one young and quick to judge, the other old and weathered by life, find themselves in a silent battle, not of words, but of worlds. The officer, frustrated and unsure, finally backs off, his expression still filled with doubt. He doesn't apologize, doesn't even acknowledge the strange tension that hangs in the air between them. The old man, without another word, revs the engine of his motorcycle, and with a steady hand, he pulls back onto the road, leaving behind a police car and a young officer who will walk away with a lesson he might not fully understand yet. The sun sinks lower, casting its final golden light on the road as the old man continues his journey, alone but undeterred. The town behind him returns to its quiet normalcy, unaware of the fleeting moment of confrontation that just transpired, a moment where suspicion met calm, and the weight of an old man's life was carried in the space between a question and an answer. As the officer's harsh words cut through the air, the old man sat motionless on his motorcycle, the weight of the situation settling like a heavy fog around them. The officer, growing increasingly agitated, paced around the veteran, his accusations sharp and biting, as if he were convinced that the old man posed a threat. Yet, the veteran remained calm, his weathered face betraying nothing but the faintest trace of frustration, his gaze unwavering. The tension was palpable, the officer's frustration clashing against the veteran's quiet dignity. The road, once peaceful, now felt like the stage for an impending storm. Just as the officer's tirade reached its peak, the sound of roaring engines broke the stillness, growing louder and louder until a line of military Humvees appeared over the horizon. They rumbled down the road with an almost cinematic precision, their tires kicking up dust that seemed to swirl in time with the rising tension. The officer's head snapped toward the approaching convoy, his body momentarily frozen as his mind raced to comprehend what was unfolding before him. Leading the convoy, unmistakable in his authoritative stance, was a captain tall, composed, and radiating an air of quiet command. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, quickly taking in the situation. There was no panic, no confusion, only purpose. The officer's eyes widened as the realization hit him. He recognized the veteran. This man, this old soldier, was someone far more important than he had ever assumed. The captain's gaze met the officer's, and in that silent exchange, the officer's confidence crumbled. The air grew thick with uncertainty as the Humvees came to a stop behind the officer's patrol car, the soldiers inside sitting upright, waiting for a command. The captain stepped forward, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in sight. As the officer's bravado faltered, he could feel the weight of the situation shift. His tone changed in an instant, from the sharp, accusatory edge to one of tentative politeness, as if he were suddenly unsure of the man in front of him. The old veteran remained motionless on his bike, his gaze fixed ahead, his silence speaking volumes. The officer's words faltered, his sense of authority crumbling under the captain's steady gaze. The captain approached the officer with deliberate steps, his boots crunching the gravel beneath him, each sound marking a shift in power. With a simple nod, he acknowledged the veteran, a recognition that made the officer's earlier reprimand seem painfully out of place. The captain's eyes never left the officer as he walked past him, not a word spoken yet conveying more than any speech ever could. The officer's breath caught in his throat as the captain stood beside the veteran, the two soldiers locked in a brief but meaningful exchange. In that moment, the officer understood. The veteran was not just a man to be dismissed or insulted. He was a soldier, a hero, someone who had earned the respect of not only his country but those who wore the same uniform. The officer, now keenly aware of his error, felt a deep wave of shame wash over him. He glanced back at the veteran, who, despite the earlier tension, remained composed. His silence, an unspoken testament to the strength he had carried with him through the years. The captain's arrival was not just a rescue, it was a reminder. A reminder that respect could not be taken for granted, that assumptions could be dangerous, and that heroes were not always recognized by their appearance but by the hearts of those who truly understood what they had done. The convoy of Humvees, once a symbol of military might, now stood as a symbol of unity and loyalty, a force reminding everyone present of the value of recognizing others for who they truly were, not who they appeared to be. The officer's demeanor, once filled with arrogance, now softened with humility, as he stood quietly, no longer in control of the situation but in awe of what had just unfolded. The veteran, a simple man with a lifetime of stories behind him, had become the center of a moment that transcended everything. As the captain and the veteran exchanged a final glance, it was clear that the old man would not be pushed around any longer. The officer, having learned a painful lesson, stood aside, allowing the veteran to continue on his way, a small but significant victory in a world that so often overlooked the quiet strength of those who had given their all. As the captain approached the scene, his eyes first locked onto the old man on the bike, a solitary figure framed by the blinding midday sun. The officer had been harsh with him at first, his patience worn thin by years of dealing with the everyday chaos of the streets. The old man's disheveled appearance, his slow, deliberate pedaling, and the oddity of his presence in the middle of a busy intersection had made him an easy target for the captain's irritation. He had barked orders, demanding to know what the man was doing in the way, urging him to move along, his voice sharp with the kind of authority that only time on the job could cultivate. But as he drew nearer, something in the old man's features caught the captain off guard, something that shifted the tension in the air. His weathered face, scarred not just by age but by the passage of years marked with experiences far beyond the ordinary, seemed somehow familiar. The captain's mind whirred, scrambling for context. When the memory finally hit him with the force of a thunderclap, the old man on the bike was none other than Richard Grayson, a name spoken in hushed reverence in certain circles, a man whose courage had become the stuff of legend. Grayson had been a decorated war hero, one who had endured unspeakable horrors on the battlefield and returned home with nothing but scars to show for it. His name had been immortalized in military history for his valor under fire, his incredible acts of heroism that had saved countless lives and turned the tide of a crucial battle. But that was a lifetime ago, the captain realized, and Grayson had long since faded into the fabric of the city's forgotten corners. The reality of what he was witnessing now, this frail, bent old man pedaling through the streets as if the weight of the world were on his shoulders, was almost too much to reconcile with the memories of the brave young soldier the captain had heard about in stories. His breath caught in his throat as he saw the full scope of the old man's stoic suffering. The captain's heart twisted with an unexpected wave of sympathy. The hard lines of his face softened, and his stance, once rigid and demanding, slackened with the realization that his earlier outburst had been unjust, even cruel. He took a step back, feeling the weight of his own misplaced authority, and quietly acknowledged to himself the truth he had almost forgotten, that heroes, like all people, are not immune to the ravages of time. The streets he had walked so confidently in the past now belonged to someone else, someone who had long ago given all they could, who had fought not just on foreign soil but on an unspoken battlefield within themselves. The captain had been so quick to judge, to assume that the old man was nothing more than another nuisance in the way of his daily duties. But now, as he stood there with the sun casting long shadows between them, the captain was struck by a powerful sense of guilt. He had failed to see the dignity that still remained in the old man's quiet struggle, the pride that carried him through each slow pedal of the bike. And yet, in the eyes of the captain, it was not just the past that defined Richard Grayson, it was the quiet resilience that had shaped him over decades, the way he had survived so much only to become invisible in a world that seemed to forget its heroes. Grayson's expression, though tired, carried a certain wisdom, an understanding of things that could never be taught in training manuals or military drills. The captain, now fully aware of the gravity of the moment, felt an immense shame rise in his chest. He had been too caught up in his own life, his own struggles, to recognize that this was no ordinary man standing before him. This was a man who had stood face to face with death, who had stared into the abyss and walked away scarred but still whole. The old man on the bike had earned his place in history, yet here he was, no longer a war hero, no longer the embodiment of the nation's strength and pride, but a forgotten relic, a casualty of time's unyielding march. The captain's embarrassment deepened, but with it came a powerful resolve to make amends. He stepped forward, his voice no longer sharp but laced with respect, and asked softly, "Can I help you, sir?" The words, simple yet profound, hung in the air, the weight of them bridging the chasm that had once separated the two men. In that moment, the captain understood what it meant to truly see another person not as a symbol or a relic of the past, but as a human being, worthy of compassion and respect. And though Grayson may have never been in a position to hear those words before, in this fleeting exchange, the captain knew he had given him something the old man had long been denied: recognition. The old man stood in front of the officer, his posture straight but unassuming, as the cold morning air whispered through the streets. His weathered face was a map of decades lived, each wrinkle, each line, a silent testament to the battles fought, the hardships endured, and the sacrifices made. His uniform, once crisp and vibrant with youth, now hung loosely on his frail shoulders, a faded reminder of a time when the world had felt different. Medals of valor, hard-earned and well-deserved, glinted under the dull light, but there was no boast in his eyes, no arrogance in his stance. The officer, young and fresh-faced, stared at him for a long moment, confusion clouding his judgment. The old man had been stopped on suspicion of wrongdoing, a mere formality of procedure, the officer justified in his actions by the regulations of the moment. But as he looked closer, he noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat: a series of battle ribbons and medals decorating the man's chest. A pang of guilt struck him as the truth began to settle: this was no ordinary civilian. This was a man who had given more than he would ever say. Still, the officer, hesitant, cleared his throat and asked the question that had been on his mind: "Are you sure you're not lost, sir?" The old man didn't respond immediately. His eyes, soft but firm, met the officer's gaze, and for a fleeting second, the officer could have sworn he saw something far deeper in those eyes, something older than the moment they shared, something that spoke of unspoken wars, silent losses, and memories buried in places too sacred for words. The old man's mouth curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile, but there was no smugness to it. He did not speak of his bravery, his courage, or his service. He didn't remind the officer of the lives he'd saved, the battles he'd fought, or the years spent away from loved ones. He didn't speak of the things he had done in the service of his country, things that most would never understand or even be able to comprehend. No, he simply said, "I know where I'm going, son. Don't worry about me." His voice was soft, yet it carried with it an undeniable weight, as though every word had been earned through years of experience. The officer, now realizing the magnitude of his mistake, stood silently, his chest tightening with an unfamiliar sense of humility. It was strange, this feeling of seeing someone so full of grace despite the years of suffering they had undoubtedly endured. There was no bitterness, no anger in the old man's words, just a quiet acceptance of the journey he had walked and the path he was still on. The officer, his face reddening with the sudden rush of embarrassment, instinctively took a step back. How could he have been so quick to judge? How could he have overlooked the silent strength in front of him, a strength that had been built on sacrifices he would never know? But the old man didn't seem to notice the officer's inner turmoil. He merely nodded, as though this was all just another ordinary exchange in a lifetime filled with them. He adjusted his jacket, his fingers brushing over the metals once more as if to confirm their presence. It was as though he were telling the officer, without saying a word, that his past wasn't for show, wasn't for display. His metals were not just pieces of metal. They were pieces of his soul, earned in ways that could never be fully articulated. The officer, his heart heavy with both regret and newfound respect, stood rooted to the spot, realizing that some people carried their burdens not on their backs, but in their hearts, in the quiet dignity of their lives. The old man's footsteps echoed softly as he began to walk away, his movements slow but steady. The officer watched him go, his mind still reeling with the realization that humility was not the absence of greatness, it was the quiet acknowledgement that greatness need not be shouted to be seen. In the stillness that followed, the officer knew he had witnessed something rare, the power of a true hero, not in the tales he could tell, but in the life he chose to live. The convoy rumbled down the dusty road, its engines growling and tires kicking up clouds of dirt as it made its way to the base. Among the soldiers riding in the back of the truck was an old man, gray hair slicked back, his weathered face a map of time, yet unmistakably proud. He had seen too much, lived through more than most could comprehend, and though his uniform was worn and his posture bent from years of service, the presence of this veteran was a living testament to the sacrifices of those who came before. As the truck approached a small outpost, a sudden, unexpected sight caught the officer's attention. His eyes darted to the road ahead as the convoy slowed to a stop. The veteran, standing at the edge of the road, raised his hand in a slow but deliberate gesture, the unmistakable salute of a man who had been taught honor from the very first days of his service. The officer, distracted and perhaps even slightly annoyed by the delay, could hardly contain the rolling frustration that built within him. He was a young man, freshly promoted, filled with pride and ambition, still so wrapped up in the notions of protocol and command that he often missed the deeper meanings behind actions like these. He expected the convoy to continue its course without interruption, but then something remarkable happened. One by one, the soldiers in the back of the truck began to rise, their bodies stiff but determined, as if they had been rehearsing this very moment their entire lives. They snapped to attention and raised their hands in a salute, acknowledging the old man with a reverence that felt almost ancient in its sincerity. The officer's jaw tightened as he watched in disbelief. His gaze flicked between the men in the convoy, their postures solid, the gravity of the gesture palpable in their stiff forms. They were no longer just soldiers, in that moment, they were sons, grandsons, students of a history far beyond their years. The officer felt his chest tighten. Why had they stopped? Why this sudden respect for a man who seemed so far removed from the wars they fought, so distant from the battles they knew? He felt the shame start to creep in, a heat rising in his face, the flush of a man caught in a truth he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. As the convoy sat in stillness, the silence stretched long. It was broken only by the soft hum of the engine and the occasional crackle from the radio. The officer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting back to the soldiers, who stood at attention, still saluting. The old man, whose once sharp gaze had softened with age, lowered his hand slowly, as though accepting this tribute not just as a formality but as a deeper acknowledgement of his journey. He turned his gaze toward the officer, locking eyes with him for the briefest of moments, an unspoken exchange of recognition and perhaps even understanding. The officer felt something inside him stir, a humility he had not known before. This was not about rank or insignificance, it was about a bond forged in shared experience, a respect that transcended time and position. He could see it now, the unbreakable thread connecting the men in the truck to the old man who stood in the road. They had never fought together. They had never shared the same trenches, but they understood the weight of the sacrifice, the burden of the uniform. And in that moment, as the officer's gaze dropped, he realized that no amount of rank, no military title, could match the reverence that came with the simple act of honoring another's service. His heart ached with the realization. He had been so absorbed in his own small corner of the world, his own career, his own rise through the ranks, that he had forgotten the greater meaning of what it meant to serve. It was not about prestige or accolades, it was about giving, about enduring, about the silent, unseen costs that were paid by so many, far beyond the battlefield. The old man's salute was a reminder of that. As the convoy started moving again, the officer remained silent, his eyes cast downward. The soldiers resumed their seats, their backs still straight, their salutes held until they could no longer see the old man in the rearview mirror. The officer could feel the weight of their collective respect pressing down on him, an unspoken reminder that he had much to learn. The truck rumbled back to life, the engine's hum filling the silence, but for the officer, the world had shifted. He no longer saw the veteran as a relic of the past or as someone who had merely aged out of their usefulness. He saw him as a symbol, a living monument to the very ideals he had sworn to uphold. And in that fleeting moment, he understood what it truly meant to serve. The old man's weathered hands gripped the handlebars of the bike with a strength that belied his age, his knuckles white and veins bulging as he slowly dismounted, his legs trembling slightly beneath him. He paused for a moment, feeling the familiar ache in his joints, the years of wear and tear echoing in the slightest of movements. The officer, a young man with sharp eyes and a tone that suggested impatience, watched with curiosity. He hadn't expected the frail figure in front of him to have the strength to hold himself upright, much less to move with such determination. The old man straightened, as though the weight of his past were somehow lighter now that it was being shared. With deliberate effort, he straightened his back and looked the officer squarely in the eyes, his gaze sharp, almost piercing, like a relic of a time long past but never truly forgotten. "I was once part of the convoy," he said, his voice carrying a deep, gravelly resonance that seemed to reverberate with decades of untold stories. The officer's eyebrows furrowed, not understanding at first. The old man's words hung in the air for a moment, like the last breath of something ancient and sacred. He could see the officer's confusion, the flicker of doubt in his eyes, and yet the old man stood tall, unwavering. "I know it's hard to believe," he continued, his voice softened by both age and memory, "but I was there, in the heart of it all. When the world was divided, and the lines between us and them were so clear, I chose to serve. I served with pride, as many of us did. I was younger than stronger, faster, driven by something greater than myself." His eyes drifted for a moment, lost in the corridors of time, before he returned to the officer's gaze, his resolve hardening again. The officer, unsure of what to make of this frail old man claiming a life he could scarcely imagine, hesitated. But there was something in the way the old man stood, the dignity in his posture, the fire that still burned in the depths of his tired eyes. It spoke of something real, something beyond the graying hair and wrinkled skin. Something he couldn't yet place, but knew he could not dismiss. "You see," the old man continued, his voice thickening with the weight of years and regrets, "even as the world changes, even as the years take their toll, there's something inside that doesn't fade. Something that never truly dies. The pride, the duty, the love for a land that asks so much of its people. I may not be able to run like I used to, or fight as I once did, but the spirit? That hasn't gone anywhere. Not yet. The officer shifted, unsure whether to speak or simply listen. But the old man's story tugged at something within him, something he had long ago buried under the weight of modernity and the pressures of the present. The officer couldn't help but wonder if this fragile man had once been a giant, a warrior in a different era, carrying the hopes and burdens of a country that had long since moved on. As the old man spoke, his words painted pictures of distant battlefields, long roads traveled in the heat of the day and under the cover of night. He spoke of comrades, now gone, their faces sharp and vivid in his memory despite the fog of time. He recalled moments of quiet camaraderie, the unspoken bond that formed between those who risked their lives for something greater than themselves. There were stories of sacrifice, loss, and perseverance, of fighting not only the enemy on the battlefield, but the doubts that festered deep inside a battle that never ended. The officer listened, his skepticism slowly melting away, replaced by a growing sense of reverence. The man in front of him had lived a life that he could not yet comprehend, a life filled with struggles and triumphs that had shaped him into the person he was today. He had carried that weight alone for so long, but now, for a brief moment, the officer was allowed to share in the burden, to glimpse what it meant to carry a country's legacy. The old man's eyes softened as he finished his tale, and for the first time, the officer saw the fragility beneath the stoic exterior. The years had carved their marks on him, but the heart, the soul of the man before him remained unbroken. "I'm not as young as I used to be," the old man said quietly, his voice breaking ever so slightly. "But I still have something to give. Something that hasn't been taken from me yet." The officer stood in silence, moved by the depth of the old man's words. He realized, in that moment, that some things, some truths could never be measured by age or appearance. The old man may have looked frail, but the fire within him still burned bright. And it was a fire that no one, not time nor circumstance, could ever extinguish. In the soft, golden glow of the late afternoon, the officer stood silently for a moment, his gaze shifting between the old man and the crowd that had gathered around them. His heart, heavy with the weight of the mistake he had made, thudded painfully in his chest. The old man, once a figure of calm assurance, had been wronged, accused unjustly of a crime he hadn't committed, his frailty misunderstood by those in power. The officer had, in his rush to enforce authority, misjudged the situation entirely. His eyes were still clouded with the embarrassment of his hasty actions, the harsh words, the rough handling, the public shaming. He had not considered the man's age, nor the quiet dignity with which he carried himself. He had seen only a figure to control, not a human being with his own story, his own pain, and his own rights. Now, as the echoes of the crowd's murmurs faded into the background, the officer realized just how wrong he had been. He had always prided himself on upholding justice, but here, in the face of a quiet old man whose life had been shaped by a different era, he had lost sight of what truly mattered. Stepping forward, the officer cleared his throat, the words caught in his throat for a moment, tangled in a web of shame and regret. He had spent years in his role, but never had he felt the sharp sting of error quite like this. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper, heavy with the weight of his apology. The old man, his face marked by lines of age and wisdom, turned slowly to face the officer. There was no anger in his eyes, no fire of resentment. Only a calm, almost sorrowful understanding, as if he had seen this moment coming long before it arrived. The officer waited, unsure of what the response might be, perhaps a bitter retort, perhaps the old man's refusal to forgive. Yet, as the old man's hand slowly raised in the air, it was not to strike or accuse, but to offer something far more profound: forgiveness. The gesture, simple yet powerful, spoke volumes. No words were necessary. It was a silent acknowledgement that the past could not be changed, but that the officer's mistake had not left a permanent scar on the old man's spirit. The crowd, sensing the gravity of the moment, fell into a hushed silence, witnessing the exchange of a deeper truth than what they had expected. The officer, his breath catching in his throat, stood motionless for a long moment, unsure of how to proceed. His mind raced with thoughts of all the ways he could make things right, but in that instant, the old man's forgiveness was a gift, one that could not be repaid with simple gestures or words. It was a lesson in humility, in the power of grace, and in the quiet strength of human kindness. The officer's heart, which had been burdened with guilt, slowly began to lighten as he recognized the depth of the old man's generosity. It wasn't just forgiveness that was being offered, it was a second chance, a reminder that every person, no matter their age, had a voice, a dignity that deserved respect. And in that moment, the officer understood something he had never truly grasped before: true justice wasn't just about enforcing rules and authority, it was about recognizing the humanity in others, about choosing empathy over judgment, and about acknowledging the mistakes we make along the way. As the officer straightened up, a sense of calm washed over him. He offered a small, grateful nod to the old man, a silent promise to carry the lesson forward in his actions from that day onward. There would be no more mistakes like this, not because he was perfect, but because he had learned the hardest, yet most important lesson of all: that forgiveness is not just a gesture, but a healing force that has the power to transform both the one who offers it and the one who receives it. The old man's eyes, soft with age and experience, met the officer's gaze one final time. There was no judgment there, only a quiet knowing, a shared understanding that, though the officer had faltered, he had found his way back to something greater. With a soft sigh, the old man turned and began to walk away, his pace unhurried, his head held high, as if the weight of the world had been lifted, not just from his shoulders, but from the officer's as well. The crowd, too, began to disperse, leaving behind only the memory of a simple, yet profound act of forgiveness that had unfolded before them, a reminder of the power of grace, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting its final ember glow over the war-torn landscape, the officer stood in solemn reflection, watching his soldiers prepare to depart. The distant sound of boots scuffing against the earth, the muffled clink of gear being fastened, and the heavy breaths of the weary men were the only sounds that filled the air. Yet, amidst the bustle, there was one figure who seemed to embody the very essence of quiet strength: the old man, his wrinkled hands clasped firmly behind his back, standing motionless by the side of the campfire. His face, lined with years of hardship and sacrifice, reflected the stoic dignity of someone who had lived through more battles than his body could bear to recall. To the officer, the sight of the old man was a stark reminder of the deeper, often unspoken meaning of service, one that extended far beyond the flashes of valor and the medals of honor. He had been a part of many campaigns, seen countless soldiers rise and fall, but none had ever left a mark on him quite like the old man's presence did now. The officer had always believed that heroism was about grand gestures, the overwhelming victories, the celebrated actions of those whose names would be etched into history. But here, in the presence of this silent, unassuming figure, he felt a profound shift within himself. The old man had not asked for attention, had not sought the accolades or the praise that so many others sought to fill the void within their hearts. Instead, he stood as a testament to the quiet endurance that defines true service. His role, though invisible to most, was one of unwavering commitment, a steady pulse in the background, a reminder of all that was sacrificed in the name of duty. The officer recalled the stories he had heard from the younger soldiers, those who had watched this man from a distance. They spoke of the years he had spent in the service of his country, the countless hours spent in forgotten trenches, providing care for the wounded, sharing stories of lost comrades, and silently bearing the weight of so much grief and sorrow. The old man never complained, he never demanded recognition. He had simply done his part, day in and day out, never once seeking glory or fame. And yet, his contributions were immeasurable. It was not the loud, attention-grabbing feats that defined his service, but the quiet sacrifices, the long hours spent comforting those who would never see another sunrise, the countless lives touched in ways that could never be quantified. The officer felt a wave of gratitude flood over him, mingled with a deep sense of humility. How often had he focused on the battles that raged on the front lines, on the moments of bravery that were celebrated in reports and ceremonies, without truly understanding the quiet, invisible wars that were fought by those like the old man. He thought of the families who had given up their loved ones, of the mothers who had wept for sons they would never see again, of the countless men and women who had sacrificed not just their time, but pieces of their very souls. It was not the soldiers with medals that deserved the most recognition, the officer realized, but those whose sacrifices would never be known. Those who gave, without hesitation, without expectation, without the need for anything in return. The officer's eyes welled with emotion as he stood before the old man, realizing that this was the true meaning of service. It was not about the fleeting moments of glory, the temporary fame, or the accolades. It was about the quiet, selfless dedication to a cause greater than oneself. The officer felt a deep sense of respect for the old man, not just for what he had done, but for who he was, a silent hero whose strength lay in his humility. The world may never know his name, but his legacy would live on in the hearts of those who had witnessed the depth of his sacrifice. As the soldiers gathered their gear and prepared to move on, the officer made his way to the old man's side, standing for a moment in shared silence. There were no words to capture the weight of the moment, no phrases that could adequately express the gratitude he felt. Instead, he simply placed a hand on the old man's shoulder, a gesture of respect that spoke louder than any speech could. And as they all turned to leave, the officer understood, more deeply than ever before, that the true heroes of this world are often the ones who never seek the spotlight, who never demand applause, but who serve with a quiet, unwavering dignity that makes the world a better place for all. As the convoy rumbled down the dusty road, the officer stood alone, his boots planted firmly on the earth, his gaze fixed on the receding figure of the old man. The hum of engines gradually faded into the distance, but the stillness that followed was far more profound than the noise that had once filled the air. The sun, now lower in the sky, cast long shadows across the landscape, and in that quiet moment, a deep sense of reflection began to take root within him. The officer, a man hardened by years of duty and the unrelenting demands of his position, had never imagined that this journey would end in such an unexpected way. He had set out with a mission in mind, believing that his purpose was clear, that his authority was unchallenged, and that his role was merely to carry out the orders given to him. But somewhere along the way, the path had shifted, and the course of his understanding had taken a turn he hadn't anticipated. The old man had been a mere figure in the periphery of his thoughts, at first an inconvenience, a relic of the past who had no place in the fast-paced, modern world the officer knew. His slow, deliberate movements, the creased face and the stooped shoulders, had seemed like nothing more than signs of age and weakness. And yet, in the brief exchange they had shared, something had shifted. The officer remembered the quiet wisdom in the old man's eyes, the way he had spoken not with the force of authority, but with the quiet, unwavering strength of someone who had lived long enough to understand the true nature of life. He had spoken of kindness, of patience, and of the value of seeing others not as obstacles or problems to be solved, but as human beings deserving of dignity and respect. At first, the officer had dismissed it all. What could an old man, so far removed from the rigors of military life, possibly know about the complexities of duty and power? But now, standing alone in the twilight of the day, those words echoed in his mind like a soft but persistent whisper. The officer's heart ached as he thought of how easily he had overlooked the old man's presence, how quickly he had judged him based on his appearance, his age, and his perceived lack of relevance. It was a humbling realization, one that stung with the sharpness of self-awareness. In that moment, he understood that he had been blind, trapped in his own narrow perspective, unable to see the richness of life beyond his rigid sense of duty. The officer had always believed that power was something to be wielded, that authority was a sign of strength, and that respect had to be earned through force or status. But the old man had shown him a different path, one where true strength came not from domination or control, but from compassion and understanding. The officer's hands, once clenched in the firm grip of his weapon, now relaxed at his sides as he stood in quiet contemplation. He had learned a lesson not from the battlefield or the directives of higher ups, but from a simple, unassuming man who had offered him something far more valuable than orders or commands, a glimpse into a better way of being. The convoy was gone now, and the officer was left alone with the weight of his thoughts. The old man had ridden off into the distance, his figure growing smaller with each passing moment, but his presence remained, lingering like a shadow that would not fade. The officer knew that he would never forget this moment, this fleeting encounter that had altered the course of his life. He had learned that the greatest lessons often came when least expected, and that the most profound shifts in perspective could come from the most unlikely sources. As the sun dipped lower, the officer finally turned and began walking back toward the place where his comrades waited. But now, with each step, he walked not with the certainty of his former self, but with a new sense of humility and purpose. The road ahead remained uncertain, but he now understood that the journey itself, the people he encountered along the way, and the lessons they offered, would be far more important than the destination. The old man, in his quiet wisdom, had left a lasting mark on the officer's heart, one that would shape his decisions, his relationships, and his understanding of the world in ways he could never have imagined. And as he walked forward, a subtle peace began to settle in his chest, the realization that moving forward meant more than simply continuing on a path. It meant carrying the lessons of the past with him, allowing them to guide him toward a future that was kinder, wiser, and more compassionate.